Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Goldhaber, and I am proud to be a member of Voice for Israel, North Carolina, the sponsor of tonight's event. I also want to express my deep appreciation and recognize our co-sponsors, the Raleigh Cary Jewish Federation, Jewish for Good, Stand With Us, Kehillah Synagogue, and Bethel Synagogue. We couldn't do it without the kind of support that all of these organizations always add to our events. Now, before I introduce Scott, let me remind everybody that they can put questions in the question and answer box. I'm going to have a conversation with Scott for a few minutes, and we're going to talk through some questions, but we're going to leave plenty of time for all of you to ask questions as well. It is really my pleasure to introduce Scott Shay, someone who I'm proud to call a friend. I wish we were together tonight as opposed to over Zoom, but it's still great. Scott is somebody who has been successful in multiple arenas. Scott is the co-founder and chairman of Signature Bank, which supports small businesses and is a leader in the emerging digital currency ecosystem. And as we know, a successful author of 3 books. The latest is Conspiracy U, which we're going to discuss tonight. A remarkably timely book, which I'm reminded about every day, not just because of what happens on campus, but because of people like Whoopi Goldberg. There is just lots of reasons for this book to be so timely. But frankly, Scott, I have to say, as someone who does know you, I was surprised to see Conspiracy U. It came so quickly after your outstanding second book, which I highly recommend to people, In Good Faith, which examines the fundamental question of faith and religion in modern society. And to me, is a remarkable response to atheists. It makes the case for multiple religions, not just ours. I learned an enormous amount reading In Good Faith, and I think anyone who hasn't or wants to pick it up should. It is a very well documented book. I know it took you years, and so I was shocked to see the book come out, this new book, Conspiracy U, come out so quickly. I just have to ask, where did you find the energy to do this? Was this something that you had planned to do all along?
Well, I didn't plan to write Conspiracy U. First of all, thank you for those kind words, Mark. Really appreciate it. And it's great to see you, and even virtually. We've known each other for a long time. Probably more than we want to count. Yeah. More years than we want to count. So I'm happy to be with you virtually. I wish I was there. I truly do wish I was there in person. Not just to see all of the members of Voice for Israel, North Carolina, but to see you.
Thank you.
So let me just say, I wrote this book. This was not a book I planned on writing. I had another book in mind, which I definitely put to the side. Because I was tired. You're right. 5 years of writing In Good Faith, I was ready to take a break. And then I started writing a 2,500 word article that was due to commemorate the 75th anniversary of my father's liberation from Auschwitz. He passed away, but it would have been 75 years. And I ended up, as part of that, reading Arthur Butz's book, a professor of engineering at Northwestern University, a tenured professor, who wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century, which essentially argues that the Holocaust didn't really happen. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. But I was gonna write something because he came out as a Jew hater while I was an undergraduate. And at some point, I just made the decision to read his book. and it's like, it was like jumping into a cesspool without goggles on. But I was surprised by a couple of things, because Professor Butts claims not to have anything against Jews. Heaven forbid. He
They
claims,
never do.
heaven forbid. He claims, look, the Holocaust didn't happen, and he's a professor, so he has to deal with some uncomfortable facts. It's a 500-page book, but that there are tens of thousands of documents spread across Europe detailing the execution of the murder of 6 million Jews. There's minutes from the Wannsee Conference, which in 1942, which detailed the plan for the final solution. And that's where the final solution name came from. And he also has to deal with the fact that there are many Germans who confessed to being perpetrators, said they were witnesses, confessed to murdering countless Jews, confessed to being guards, confessed to a whole bunch of stuff. So as I was reading this, I realized that in essence, he says this is all the problem of the Zionists. The Jews are fine, but the Zionists did this. And he does it by way of a conspiracy theory. He says any fact that seems to go in the other direction is part of, it's incorporated into the conspiracy theory. So for example, the problem of the documents, this evil cabal of Zionists planted many thousands of documents forged documents across Europe, hoping that they would be, and planning for them to be, quote unquote, accidentally discovered. And all of those folks who confessed, these were pure, innocent, loving Nazis who would never have imagined committing crimes against humanity. They were good people. As a matter of fact, the real problem was that the British and the Americans dissed them and blamed them falsely. These were terribly nice people, and the Jews were just put in detention camps from time to time to protect them against Russians. So in other words, whatever negative fact there is incorporated. So then I'm still writing this 2,500 word essay, which has now grown to more than 10,000 words. And then I was reminded of what people on the left were saying. So Stephen Saleta, professor, in a book published by, of course, Duke University Press, wrote, the Nazi Holocaust in Europe seems a direct antecedent to Israel's founding. There were plans from the outset of Zionism to rid the promised land of its indigenous population. The problem with the remembrance of the Nazi Holocaust is that it happens in isolation from historic relevant events and their ongoing consequences. It's not useful if a corresponding genocide is taking place with the Palestinians at the hands of Israel. So time and time again, I found professors at Northwestern, in some cases I talk about professors other places too, who, but interestingly enough, many of them published by Duke University Press, who say the exact same thing, except actually the professor on the left goes one further. Butts merely says that some Jews died from typhoid. Stephen Saleta actually blames the Holocaust on the Jews. And yet these are professors. They're being published, and at least in the case of on the far left, by major presses such as Duke, Stanford, and I could go on and on. And that's why I wrote the book. So I spent all of my discretionary free time for 20 months just doing nothing but writing. And hence, that's where Conspiracy U came from, because I thought it was so urgent. I am actually really sorry that it has become even more urgent since I wrote it.
Yes, regrettably, it's shockingly timely. And for those of us in North Carolina, we've sort of seen this up close and personal. In North Carolina, both at Duke and at the University of North Carolina, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist issues we confronted frankly, far too often over the last several years. This year, at the beginning of the school year at UNC, an instructor of a course titled The Conflict Over Israel and Palestine wrote a series of tweets, which she ultimately deleted, that were clearly anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. After an outcry from the Jewish community, the university decides that she can continue to teach the class, but will have some additional oversight. And she, and I'm sure she really regretted those tweets that she wrote, is what basically we were told. And it really struck me that how do we grow the understanding that anti-Zionism is just the latest flavor of anti-Semitism?
Well, one of the things I talk about in my book, for those viewers and participants, anti-Zionism is just anti-Semitism. It's another sort of fancy way of saying anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, is saying Jewish hatred. So before the 1870s, people just called hating Jews Jewish hatred. And then this guy, Wilhelm Marr, who was a German politician, came up with this idea that it didn't sound so good just to say Jewish hatred, Judenhass. So he wanted to come up with a better name. So he came up with anti-Semitism, and he started the Anti-Semitism League. And this is respectable because this isn't about Jewish hatred. This is about Semitism, whatever that means. And so even the actually what's going on here has been misappropriated. There's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which I point everybody to, which among other things talks about blatant demonization and disproportionate focus. Let me give you two not so fun facts. In the last year or so, about 377,000 people have been killed in combat and in humanitarian and just in civilians in Yemen. Anybody talking about that? Is there a single protest about that? Syria, something like 600,000 people. You could argue, some people argue maybe, nobody argues less than 500,000 people. 600,000 people have been murdered and in the Syrian civil war, and 2.5 million have been displaced as refugees. I haven't heard one campus protest on any of that. There's no BDS movement against the Syrian regime. It's a sort of blatant demonization. It's so funny, and I'm not the only one. A few people have pointed this out. We're now, those of you who are listening are not watching the Olympics taking place in China. Amnesty International had a wonderful opportunity this week and next week to highlight human rights issues in China, but they didn't, because it was more urgent for them to focus on the Jews. So it's still on their webpage if you look at it. But 12 million Uyghurs oppressed, 1 million in detention camps. Not really important because, again, we're talking about the Jews. Yemen, not really important. We're talking about the Jews. Syria, not really important. We're talking about the Jews. And I think that needs to be called out because it's not. It's not called out on campus. Let me give you an example of Duke University Press, which is one of my favorites because I realized this. It's interesting we're having this talk, but I realized this when I was doing research on the book, and I'm like looking at for footnoting, and I keep footnoting Duke University Press. If you go on the website right now, there's something like 10 pages of anti-Israel books. Some are just pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. Most are anti-Israel. Most are demonizing Israel, like Stephen Salaita's book titled "Israel's Dead Soul," which is one of the kinder titles you'll find. And these are all supposedly peer-reviewed. Now look at the Kurds and what they have suffered. There's 3 books. You don't need a full page for that. So I think we need to just keep calling it out, because I have to say, it's not called out. It's not called out at all.
No, it's not, and you know, it's surprising to me. I didn't realize, you know, about the Duke University Press. You know, which reminds me of something that I was struck by in your book, and you touched on it a little bit, but if you can expand a little bit on it. You know, you talk about Professor Butts, a Holocaust denier. You talk about Stephen Thrasher. I'll call him an anti-Zionist progressive. Um, but remarkably, your book makes the point that they really use the same source material. And
Yep.
I was really struck by that, that basically the far right and I'll call it the far left seem to be drawing from the same source material. Can you spend a minute or two talking about that?
Well, that's one of the things that I do in the book, and it actually did surprise me it was actually an inkling of that got me going from the 2,500 words to the book, which is I realized that they were saying things that I first thought they sort of rhymed, but then I realized they're saying precisely the same thing in many cases. And you have the Institute for Historical Review, which is Arthur Butts, one of the Holocaust denial, you know, sort of attempted academic sites. They're constantly retweeting, republishing the things that that are being printed on the far left. David Duke retweets Representative Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who he would not like because she's from Africa, a person of color, an immigrant, et cetera, but because she hates Israel and is anti-Semitic, he's happy to retweet. We retweet her remarks and has said she's the most important person in Congress right now because she says the truth about Israel. Both the far left and the far right, and I think this is one thing I show in the book, see Israel and see Jews as evil cabals, co-conspirators, conspiring on the far left. On the far right, Jews are fake white. They're not really white. And they're conspiring to harm, in the case of Butts, Germans, white people. I mean, he says that the Jews stole money from Germany and dispossessed the Palestinians, who he doesn't really have as much respect for, but he makes the point that he doesn't use the term fake white, but essentially Jews are oppressing white people. In the case of the far left, Jews are considered hyper white. In Stephen Thrasher's terms, they've got drones above Gaza gassing people. Again, borrowing from Holocaust, which the far left seems very, very keen to do, borrowing from Holocaust imagery constantly. And again, it's a cabal, an Israel lobby, deep, dark forces that are mysterious. The Israel lobby. Israel is some sort of demonic power. There are 7 million Jews at most in Israel, and somehow they're oppressing 6 billion people in the world. And then both sides see victimization, the far right and the far left, through race, through the lens of race. For the far left, it's people of color, and for the far right, it's white people. Who, you know, when you read this literature, it's very difficult to read, but they feel that that whites are being victimized and being denuded of their deserved supremacy. It's not a happy story, but one place that the far right and the far left are hand in hand, unanimous, hating Jews.
Yeah. So, you know, as someone who has done public affairs in my life, I can sort of spot a campaign. These things don't happen randomly. And as I look at, as you say, anti-Semitism slash anti-Zionism, people think, oh, this has popped up in the last few years. But to me, this looks like it's been a long, organized effort, and that is regrettably now bearing more fruit than I would like it to. And so I'd love your observation on sort of how this campaign got started, if you think about it as a campaign. And really, the follow up question is, as Jewish communities, how do we build a campaign to respond?
So, first of all, that's a very good question. And one of the things I did in the book that again surprised me is that there has been a campaign from the 70s, really. Things are very different on campus from the 70s to today. And it was mindful. Certainly the far right, as I show in the book, and I learned from my teacher at Wexner, Deborah Lipstadt, hopefully soon to be Ambassador Lipstadt, about the far right. But I think what was less known was that the far left had a campaign, and folks have essentially said that they knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, Omar Bugatti, Jasper Puar, they've indicated that it doesn't matter whether any of this is true or false. It's not really besides the point. That's really besides the point. The point is getting people involved in hating Israel, hating Jews. And so one of the things that's critical to understand is that the easiest way to hack a human being is to get them to believe in a conspiracy theory. That, by the way, doesn't just relate to Jews. I mean, it's not exactly the same. That's how you got Jonestown. If you get people to believe in a certain alternate view of the world, you can get them to do just about anything really crazy. And people don't actually, and I want to make a short digression here, which is understanding the difference between a theory about a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. I mean, you can have a theory about a conspiracy. You can say, well, maybe the COVID-19 virus was leaked from the Wuhan virology lab. And then your job is to collect as many facts as you can, send people there, do whatever you can do. At the end of the day, you may find, yes, there's proof. Yes, there's proof it didn't happen, or we don't know. We think this is the preponderance. We don't have enough to know a preponderance. It's our suspicions. But a conspiracy theory is different because it encompasses any negative fact. So any negative fact you find, just like I explained before with butts, gets incorporated. It doesn't even need to be a Jewish conspiracy theory. Alex Jones's conspiracy theory that there was no massacre of young children at Sandy Hook. He says, well, what do you do about the dead bodies? Well, they were actors. What do you do about this? So 55, all these bodies were just faked, and it doesn't matter what facts come in hand. And so people get into this. That's what QAnon is all about, is that they become convinced of an alternative view of the universe. And that's what's happened in the academy. The academy is supposed to be, universities are supposed to be fact-based. Instead, they become theory-based and increasingly conspiracy theory-based. I talked to one woman who said she didn't like facts. Facts are messy. Theory is pure. And we need as a community to call this out and to call out professors who are making stuff up, and places like Duke University Press that have fake peer review. I mean, Jasper Puar's book that claims, among other things, published again by Duke University Press, claims that among other things that Israeli Zionists are harvesting organs from Palestinians using some sort of technology to control the biogenetic structure of Palestinians. I mean, it's almost stuff out of science fiction, published by an academic press. Won an award for best book from the Women's Studies Association of America.
My God.
This is woohoo stuff. It's not even, it wouldn't even probably make it for science fiction because, well, for a lot of reasons, but it wouldn't survive a Google fact check. But yet it was published and now it becomes a source. And I show how it was used for sources. So you make stuff up, publish it by a university press, and now it becomes something you can footnote and it's a source. It's a serious, serious problem because it undermines intellectual integrity, and it's a fundamental corruption of academia and the university.
Yeah, it's scary, and it's an issue beyond this, frankly. It's an issue for our country of how do we get back to fact-based discussions on a whole variety of things. One of the things that your book highlights and points out, something that I personally have been interested in, one of your solutions is to get some legislation passed that would basically simply require that universities, whether, that get federal funding, those universities have to make public where they're getting their endowment dollars from, if those endowment dollars are coming from overseas and from foreign countries or foreign nationals, and and what departments within the university are getting those funds, which I think is, I always think that sunshine is the best disinfectant, and I think that this kind of thing, might slow down the path and might get people to understand why some universities take the positions they're taking. Talk a little bit about that and any other elements that you think are part of a campaign for the Jewish community to respond.
So I did do research into Northwestern's funding by Qatar, and there is some disclosure today. It's not presented in a way that's easily searchable. I can tell you, having done it, having searched, but it is there, and it's very stale. But I was able to compute over $400 million of monies that went from Qatar to Northwestern University. And by extrapolation, it's been more than 500 million since if you add the time since the book has been published. And it comes with an agenda. There's no question about it. And in the book, I talk about how that agenda actually influenced the Northwestern Board of Trustees. And the irony is, Jews historically donated money to Jewish studies departments. But these Jewish studies departments are increasingly becoming anti-Israel for reasons that we need another hour discussion to talk about. I don't want to go into that digression, but I am all for making quicker. We in political campaigns, Mark, you're an expert on political campaigns. The data is available pretty quickly.
Yep.
It would be no problem to require rapid. It doesn't even need to be that rapid. Let's say within a year, donations to be disclosed by source if they're foreign, but yet they're not. Yeah. And I think Sunshine would help, but I also think foreign donations need to be scrutinized, maybe by the Department of Education or because they're not making, Qatar's not donating $500 million to Northwestern University because they're big fans of Wildcat football.
I think that's fair. Let me ask one final question, and then I'm going to leave time for the questions that Marcia has been collecting. And if we have time, I'll come back. But I guess my last question would really be one of, the Jewish community, as we all know, if we get a any kind of group of Jews together, there is a wide variety of opinion. And certainly there's a wide variety of opinion on Israel. And I've often thought that the diversity of views on Israel within the Jewish community has really been a barrier for the Jewish community to get organized and really respond and fight anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, that we really have become the frog in the pot as the water slowly gets heated up. How can Jews come together on an issue where there should be very little dispute, which is that we all want to fight anti-Semitism?
So look, I think we have to go back to the International Holocaust Remembrance Association of Anti-Semitism, JVP, and I had to read this book. This was wasn't quite as bad as reading Arthur Butts' book, but it was pretty bad. JVP wrote a book, I can fish it out, it's around my desk somewhere here, on anti-Semitism. And basically the point of the JVP book is, if you don't vociferously hate Israel and join with JVP and you're a Jew, you have what's coming to you. And I'm really not exaggerating.
Yeah.
Basically, anti-Semitism is defined as protecting people who hate Israel. Read JVP's on anti-Semitism. I mean, it's astounding for me to say that. Nevertheless, it's accurate. There's nothing you can really say against a Zionist that is not acceptable. And I think, unfortunately, so the number one question I get when I'm in front of, and I get it almost 100% of the time when I speak to Jewish groups, is what can students do to protect themselves? How do we help students? How do we arm students? How do we, et cetera? The question I get 100% of the time when I speak to Christian groups is, how do you have Jews that say these things about Israel? I get it 100% of the time without exception. And I think we have to unfortunately draw a line that says, here's what anti-Semitism is. And JVP shouldn't be allowed to come up with its own definition that says that everybody else can be oppressed, but not us Israel haters. Let the anti-Zionists create their own communities. The objective is not to let everybody free to say what they do. I mean, even in the Hebrew, even in the prayers in the Shemona Esrei, there's a paragraph in the Midah, V'lam al shnim al ti tikva. At some point you cross a line and you're not part of the Jewish people. Because if you really think it's okay for Zionists, for anything to happen to Zionists, it's really hard to include you as part of the Jewish people collective. And I think JVP is the entity that came up with the blood libel that Jews somehow aligned with police departments all across the world to oppress people of color. That came from JVP in their so-called deadly exchange report. And I think we just need to recognize that. It's a sad thing. I mean, I remember years ago, I encountered people who were involved in JVP, talked to them a little bit, but they have become doggedly Israel and doggedly haters of anybody who has any affinity toward Israel.
Yeah. I think this is a good point for me to hand the show over to Moshe. Moshe, you want to turn your video on and we can start to get some questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Great interview. And Scott, thank you so much for writing this really important book. As a parent of a Northwestern alum, I found it especially disturbing. But we're right here in the midst of a lot of things very similar to what you're talking about, being with UNC, where I worked for 30 years, and Duke right in our backyard. Somebody wrote in that they wanted you to know that several of us in this area are on the Duke faculty and have written twice to the Duke administration about exactly what you have seen emerging from the Duke press, have gotten no response at all. But thank you for being with us tonight to discuss your book. And we have a number of questions that have come in. One is an interesting idea. Can we introduce a concept called ASAIAZ to represent anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, and anti-Zionism, since they've become conflated, commingled, and commangled by the anti-Semites, anti-Israelites, and anti-Zionists, and therefore they could be dealt with together at one time. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I just want to start. I want to just go to your preamble and then I'll answer that question. I can tell you in New Jersey, where Jasper Puar, who believes that us folks on the phone are harvesting organs from Palestinians in our spare time, is on the faculty, that people have sent my book, or you can send other materials to the legislators, because your taxpayer dollars are supporting UNC. And we shouldn't be bashful anymore. I mean, there's just no reason. It's too urgent. So whatever you want to do, send something, send materials. There's other good books, you know, not just mine. Send them to the legislators, and they do read this. That's the other thing I found, is they do read. I mean, and this isn't an advertisement, my book's on a second printing, partially because people are sending them to their legislators. And I think that's something, you know, Voice for Israel can potentially lobby, you know, again, just to do what AIPAC does in essence, go and visit your state legislators and tell them, are you aware of this? We're being taxed to support a professor at UNC who hates Jews, and, you know, and an administration that's willing to cover up for that. There's no problem in doing that. And we shouldn't be bashful, because if we do, shame on us.
That's a great idea.
So to go to the question though of you know, calling out this anti-Zionism. I mean, look, I think this goes to a bigger set of ideas, and in terms of how to try to improve the situation. And I think it's twofold. One is, we are the victims of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred. It shouldn't be on the victim to necessarily fix the problem. We need allies. You know, that's a popular term on the far left right now, but we need to engage allies. And there are allies, but we're going to need to talk to them beyond talking to ourselves. We're going to need to talk and shift the dialogue from talking about anti-Zionism to talking about what's going on in the rest of the world, Arab imperialism, that if you want to talk about apartheid and someone is chanting at the same time from the river to the sea, no Jews, and Hamas seeks the extermination or expulsion of every Jew in the Middle East, then we need to talk about that. We need to encourage people, you know, look, we need to talk to the Hispanic community. We need to talk to the Native American community. And we need to tell our story of being an indigenous people. I mean, Zionism, that's the other thing that I think we need to make the case. Zionism is not a dirty word. It's something to be proud of. I mean, and by the way, quietly, there's some indigenous peoples that recognize that are understanding that Israel reclaimed its ancestral land, revitalized its language that was dead. And we're going to need to ally with those folks. It takes work. And right now, Jews to a certain degree feel like they're in the bunker. I mean, just yesterday, the Israeli ambassador to the UK went to the Cambridge Union to speak, that's what they do, is have people come from diverse views and speak. They had somebody who was not that long ago was sort of pro-Nazi. There was no protest outside. Here, there were protests from the river to the sea. There was not quite violence. It's a serious problem, and we're going to need to be louder, much louder, and we're going to need to find allies.
So here's a question about our students. There are a number of great, well-intentioned and doing great work organizations like Stand With Us that educate Jewish students on campuses. And many of these students are aware of the facts, but do you have any ideas for how these students can confront or contest what they are hearing in class from their professors who control their references, who control their grades? And most students don't have the courage to do that.
Well, first of all, here's what I say, and I've spoken to some student groups at various campuses and writ large, and as I said, the number one question I get always is a question similar to that. And here's what my point is: it's not on the students; it's our fault. Students are in an unequal power relationship on campus. They won't get recommendations. There are already papers actually documenting how vocal Zionist students are having trouble getting recommendations for various things. If they which is an astounding set of academic corruption. We shouldn't. I think there's two tabs sort of on campus. There's a tab of Jewish students who are living good and interesting experiences. They're part of Hillel. They're not really engaged in this. They're just keeping their distance, self-censoring, and getting by. And then there's the visceral anti-Israelism, which is tab 2, which is terrible, which is trying to basically make people feel embarrassed for being Jewish. But it shouldn't be on the students. We're not sending students to university to do battle. We're sending students to university to learn chemistry or, some other subject, engineering, probably not Middle Eastern studies or the like, because or anthropology. You can't be a Zionist in most anthropology departments in the United States. But it's on us as adults, and we need to get into the game and not think that somehow students are going to solve this. Students are there for a few years. The faculty's there forever.
So here's a two-part question. Number one, how do we determine which organizations, which universities are so anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic that we wouldn't want to make donations to? And secondly, what are your thoughts about encouraging our kids and our grandkids to go to such universities?
So that's a very good question. I'm actually speaking to a group of donors, and I've been thinking about this question. I haven't actually decided exactly what I'm going to say. So I'm giving you a sort of some of the rough draft in my head. Qatar's not going to support Hebrew University or they might support Brandeis these days, but they're not going to support a pro-Israel university. And I think we have to be more mindful of where the money is going. So if you're going to donate to Duke, I would say it should be designated. And I think Jews should be more. Now, by the way, as I said, Jewish studies departments are becoming increasingly anti-Israel and to some degree anti-Jewish. I mean, there's a book out on Jewish philanthropy, which sort of has some conspiracy theories about Jews, again, written by a Jewish studies professor. Doesn't mention Hadassah, doesn't mention all the Jewish hospitals built, somehow blames all the problems of foundations on one Jewish lawyer. I mean, it's amazing. At Penn State, the National Endowment of Humanities has commissioned 2 professors to write a book that says basically everything was great for the Jews in the Middle East, and there was never any problems, and the Jews shouldn't have had, or had to be Zionists. So it's very hard, but you need to do the work and to either designate it where you're comfortable. I think it's very hard right now to be endowing a university. For example, one of the professors that I talk about in the book is the Alice Kaplan, heads the Alice Kaplan Humanities Center at Northwestern University. Now, this woman, I did some research into her. She started donating in the 40s, her and her family, and gave what today would be tens of millions of dollars to Zionist causes. Yet the person who carries her name is a believer that wrote a book that basically you have to be an anti-Zionist conspiracy theorist to even understand what she's talking about. I talk about that's Professor Jessica Winograd that I write about in the book. But so this is a woman who gave a lot of money, and clearly it didn't follow with her values in the slightest. So we have to be careful.
So you talked about how important it is for us to call out some of the things that we're seeing. How do we call out the obsession with Israel while ignoring major human rights violations of other countries? Who do we call it out to? What do we do?
Well, I think that's a hard question. By the way, I do think we need to call out I think the Jewish community hasn't done enough publicly about the Uyghurs, although we'll probably be called China washing or something if we do. But I do think we have to be authentic. I do think it is a matter of being active in the media. And it's painful because I have to tell you, I've written articles in, Chicago Tribune, other places, and you get back a lot of really sort of hate speech. So I don't want to say this is an easy thing because it ain't. But I think it is talking to the media, talking to legislators at the state level, at the city level. Look at what happened in Durham. Now, there is I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. There's a rule in Durham. There's a law in Durham that the police department can't train in Israel. So they asked the police chief, did you have any plans to ever train in Israel? No, but they're allowed to train in North Korea. They could train in, the Jiangxing province in China. Not a problem in Durham. Yemen, Syria, not a problem for the police to train there. And I think we just need to call it out and keep calling out. I don't think it's going to be successful. In Durham, a good chunk of the city council hates Jews. The anti-Israelism is again a excuse because the Jews are part of this cabal, and it's a problem. But at least it needs to be said. So here's the thing about conspiracy theories: you cannot convince, because, and I talk about this a bit in the book, it is very hard to convince someone who's in the conspiracy theory to get out. But we have to do this for the people who aren't yet initiated. So it's possible if someone just is biased against Jews, hates Jews, they're savable. It's when they think that the Jews are this evil cabal of Israel lobbyists out there in a way that's not understandable, manipulating reality, that they become unsavable. And so the reason for this calling out is actually not to, you're never going to convince Jasper Puar. She's admitted, again, you've read the book, so she's admitted she's making stuff up. It's okay to make stuff up about Jews because you might get other people in the game. where our task is people who haven't yet been brainwashed or indoctrinated.
Yeah. You mentioned the situation in Duke with the police banning training in Israel, and many of the people that are attending our program today did their very best to fight that and went to speak before the city council and wrote letters to the newspaper and wrote letters to the councilman, and to no avail, but we did our best anyway. We tried.
Yeah. Well, you have another election coming up, right?
Yep, we do.
And your mayor, the mayor who had had an operation that his spine removed, isn't running.
The same mayor now.
No, right. So at least I don't know who else is running. I don't know enough about Durham politics, but I did have an interaction with that mayor, and it's a very difficult operation of your spine removed, but apparently it works politically.
So in 2 weeks from tomorrow, actually, we're having Nachman Shai on a Zoom. I'll be mentioning that before we close out. As you know, he's the Minister of Diaspora Affairs in Israel, and he's going to be speaking to us at 9 a.m. on February 23rd. But what is your reaction to his plan, stated plan, to undertake a mission in which he would ask what Israelis can do to help North American Jews with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
So I know I have the privilege of knowing Nachman Shai for probably almost as long as I know Mark. And I'm a big fan of Nachman Shai, and he really understands North American Jewry. So I was really thrilled that he was named diaspora minister. He's thinking about all of this. I mean, I've spoken to him personally. We Zoomed each other about 2 months ago. And I'm not, it was a private conversation, but he's thinking about all of this stuff. I don't think he necessarily has a fixed, at least at the time, it wasn't a fixed plan, but I think he's open to good ideas. I mean, one of the most important things I think we need to do as a community, and this is one thing that he knows I pushed. So you wouldn't be, even if you refer to it, he'll know it well. Which I've been hawking, I've been talking about it for years, is getting Jews to go to Israel, young Jewish teens to go to Israel prior to college in a longer 3-week program, because I think it's really important to get young teens to Israel before they're told all this stuff about apartheid Israel and all this evil stuff that that Israelis are doing. And I think that's the biggest investment. And what I've suggested, that's the place that we need to focus, is teen travel to Israel. And, I used to be chair of a coalition called Lapid, which has nothing to do with Yair Lapid. It was just predated him in terms of not him personally, but the name of the organization, to get teens to Israel. And that's been taken up by the Marcus Foundation to a great degree. But I think we really need to go further and further. We really need to get every Jewish teen to Israel. And then if they make a decision that it's not for them, they don't like Israel, okay. But at least they have facts, and they haven't learned about Israel through the eyes of an anthropology professor at some university telling them that Israel's a source of all evil. I wish I were exaggerating on some of this stuff too. I mean, I might sound like I'm exaggerating or I'm using hyperbole, but I'll tell you, before I wrote this book, before I did the research for the book, forget about writing the book, I just didn't realize how deep the anti-Israelism is and how deeply faculty members believe this stuff.
So there are a number of questions about Duke University Press and specifically Jasper Puar. One of the questions is, where can we find her admission that she made this up? I think you might have a footnote in your book.
I have a footnote in it. Yeah.
Okay. And then also,
She calls, what she doesn't say, she doesn't, the word she used, so I just want to be, she says that her mission is to translate the speculative into the now, which I think is a fancy way of saying she was making it up. So I just want to be clear what I was saying.
and then along the same lines, you know, what about the possibility of somebody suing, or some organization suing Duke University Press for libel?
So the Jews would have to do that. They don't, you know, it's not, they don't libel individuals as much as this conspiratorial group that's out there of Jews who are causing all this harm. And look, you know, Duke and all these other universities have, you know, large endowments. They're pretty, you know, and I have to tell you, even the Jews on the board, I've spoken to Jews who are trustees. I haven't spoken to any trustees of Duke, but I have of other universities, and the Jews on the board value their board member. We don't have knighthoods in the United States, so they seem to value being a university trustee very highly, and they just shrink away from saying anything that would be a dispiriting word.
So here's a question. Is it fair to say that the predominant anti-Semitic activity on campus is coming from the left?
Yes, on campus for sure, but nationally, the dark web is a hotbed of anti-Israelism and anti-Zionism. So because the far right has certainly been thrown off campus, and I'm all for that. That's great. But what's happening on campus doesn't stay on campus, and it has infected society writ large. So there's no question the far left and the statistics are, and I have this in the book, it's something like 12-1 left versus right. And it's generally, and of that 12-1, a good chunk, the majority of the 12 is going to be Marxist. Not all, but probably a good chunk.
So you mentioned that the broad-based campaign to stir up anti-Jewish hatred through misinformation. Who do you assess as the target audience for this misinformation, and to what end? For instance, what is Professor Butt's motivation?
Well, look, they're trying to persuade ultimately it's a long-term game, and I think both the far right and far left get that. Ultimately, what they'd like is in 20 years for there to be no funding for the Iron Dome or any other funding for Israel. And if they can convince students who aren't even paying that much attention that Israel is really, really evil, and that's all they really sort of know. And in 20 years, they are voters, congressmen, senators, policymakers, and to a great degree, they're succeeding. I mean, I have to tell you, what the effort they've done in BDS is extremely impressive. I mean, it has spilled out into media for sure, journalism for sure, and now the ESG investment world. And that's the article I wrote, that's what I wrote in the book about Morningstar. I was really shocked. I'm in the investment business.
Thank you. We're coming up on 8 o'clock, so I don't think we're going to have time for any more questions. We did get to most of them, though. I do want to mention that the book is available on Amazon for those of you that haven't read it yet. And we also do have some books left at the Federation in Durham and the Federation in Raleigh. As Mark mentioned earlier, for a contribution of $10 to Voice for Israel, you can pick up a copy of your book, as opposed to $25 on Amazon. So that might be some incentive for you. And I also, those of you that are on today's Zoom will be receiving notice of our next program, which, as I mentioned, is with Nachman Shai, He's going to be discussing anti-Semitism and Palestinian issues, and that will be at 9 a.m. I know it's kind of early, and for those of you that work, it's a difficult time, but he is in Israel, and we are very privileged that he is taking time out of his really busy schedule because of a personal connection with a Voice for Israel member to do this for us. So we're really privileged to have him speak to us, and we have to accommodate his schedule. That will be taped, as this one also is being recorded. So if you can't make it, hopefully you'll be able to see the recording. Thank you again so much, Scott, for being with us and for the important work that you're doing.
And
good
Scott,
night.
let me echo that, and I hope that for all the people who are on the call, that Scott's call to action motivates all of us to get a little more engaged as we fight a fight that's very important to anyone who has any view of history. Again, Scott, thank you for writing the book. It's an enormous contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good evening, everybody.